The ability to shake the enemy's morale in times of war is sometimes crucial. Snipers can be especially helpful in this endeavor. An experienced sniper does not always try to kill his victim. In some cases, he seeks to hit so that the wound was extremely painful and the enemy could not continue to fight. In the maddening confusion of battle, this allows the sniper to hit the maximum number of enemies, as well as to have a psychological effect on the enemy. I saw how the inhuman screams of my wounded fighters demoralized their comrades, and the attack abruptly weakened and stopped altogether. It was in these battles with superior enemy forces that I perfected my personal sniper tactics. I paid no attention to the first 3 or 4 lines of attackers and tried to hit in the stomach as many fighters as possible who were advancing behind me. Hearing the piercing cries of the wounded behind me, the front-line attackers lost their presence of mind and the attack began to falter. At this point I turned my attention to the first lines of the enemy. The enemies who were closer than 50 meters to me, I killed with accurate shots in the head or in the heart, trying to instantly take out of the battle everyone who could. Those who were more than 50 meters away from me, on the contrary, I shot in the torso, trying to wound as many enemies as possible. When the enemy were fleeing, the shots that hit the retreating fighters in the kidney area were particularly effective. In these cases, the wounded would literally scream and howl in an animal-like manner. As a result, the attack was quickly over. In such situations, I sometimes managed to hit more than 20 enemies in a few minutes. However, such hits did not increase my sniper score. For several days, my actions helped our company to hold on. But its numbers continued to steadily decline, and we still had to retreat to avoid imminent annihilation. At night, our company began to retreat. The German fighters carried away 13 wounded. And again it was the sniper who kept the pursuing enemies at a respectful distance until dawn, when the group reached new lines of defense. There was no ethics or soldierly honor that night. There, in the bloody meat grinder, everyone thought about how to survive themselves and help their comrades to survive. Even after we reached new positions, the soldiers had no time to think about a well-deserved rest. With the beginning of a new day, the Russians again made an attack. It was more cautious, and its repulsion required from the Germans a full strain of effort. This time in the front line of the Russian offensive, along with the infantry, were 3 tanks. I prepared myself a well-camouflaged position among my comrades and hoped that the enemy would not be able to determine my location for a long time. The rest of the German infantrymen also camouflaged their new trenches as well as they could, hoping to take the Russians by surprise. But the Russians, too, not knowing what they would encounter, advanced cautiously. The Soviet infantry took cover behind their slow-moving tanks, which were now about 150 meters from the German positions. The first tank jerked abruptly to a halt, and its turret began to turn with a whirring sound, aiming its cannon in the direction of the German defense lines. The Russians, however, had not yet pinpointed the exact location of the enemy. The turret stopped, and a few seconds later the hatch opened. I already had my rifle in firing position, and my telescopic sight was aimed at the hatch cover, which was open only 2 palms wide. A head with binoculars peeked out cautiously from there. My rifle was aimed for a hit at a distance of about 120 meters. I calculated that I needed to take a couple of centimeters higher for the bullet to enter the tanker's head. A direct hit in this case was my duty, because it was my shot that was to be the signal to start the battle. For a few seconds I hesitated, but then the thought occurred to me that I was aiming at the commander of the tank, and possibly of the entire attack. His death could decide the outcome of the entire battle. A deep breath, a moment to concentrate, and my finger quietly and firmly pressed the trigger. A shot rang out. Through the telescopic sight I saw blood splatter on the hatch cover, and the head disappeared into the depths of the tank. A few seconds later the battle broke out. But the tanks didn't move. They only fired in the direction of the German positions without doing any damage to them. After a few minutes their engines roared and they retreated. My assumption probably proved to be correct. The Russian attack had evidently been left unguided, and when about an hour later the enemy tried to attack the German positions again, his actions lacked the necessary impetus and determination. A single shot, fired after careful aiming, demoralized the enemy, and it may well have been this that enabled the German riflemen to hold out. The Russian offensive came to a halt. The German front, the length of which by that time had shrunk, was not strong enough, but thanks to high morale, the Soviet breakthrough was prevented. However, in doing so, our regiment lost more than half of its soldiers. The surviving fighters were exhausted, dirty, suffered from lice, were wounded and sick. On their faces appeared deep traces of those inhuman trials that they had endured. The fascist propaganda machine cynically called it the heroic appearance of the soldiers of the Eastern Front, forged in the fire of battle. Surprisingly, I didn't have a scratch on me. I was bothered only by lice and diarrhea, which resulted from the fact that I, like many of my comrades, for many days ate mostly pickles, which we found in the abandoned village houses. At the new defense line we found competently erected positions along the Bug River, which had been constructed during the German offensive of 1941. With a little extra work, we were able to add comfortable dugouts to the defenses. Of course, they could be called comfortable only taking into account the conditions in which soldiers on the Eastern Front usually lived. The respite, which did not bode well for the future, gave the German infantrymen a week of rest, during which they received new weapons, ammunition, and even small replenishments. For the soldiers, this week was like a vacation. They were finally able to sleep, eat, and do a little personal hygiene. However, this idyll lasted only a few days. During the night, Russian assault groups crossed the river under cover of darkness. With the first rays of dawn, strong and experienced soldiers, like hungry predators, burst into the positions of my battalion. With knives and sharpened shovels in their hands, they destroyed the guard without a single shot. They took no prisoners. An attentive sentry on duty near the machine gun, looking through binoculars at the shoreline, saw 200 meters away the Russians floating on a raft. He then looked almost casually at the German forward positions. Suddenly he saw 2 Russian helmets flashing for a split second over the edge of the trench. This was followed by gunshots and machine gun bursts. Shouts began to be heard. In the trenches a fierce close combat broke out. In a few seconds all German infantrymen were raised on alarm and with weapons in their hands took their positions. Developing the attack, the Russians were crossing the river. In boats and on rafts, moving swiftly to the German-occupied opposite bank, they did not spare themselves under a hail of fire from the Wehrmacht soldiers defending their positions. However, the Russians attacked without the support of artillery, and all the advantages were on the side of the German soldiers, huddled in their competently constructed trenches. But while resistance to the troops crossing the river did not require much effort, a threatening situation was developing in the trenches attacked by Russian assault groups that had crossed during the night. In the hands of the Russians passed one section after another. Therefore, the Germans quickly formed special groups to launch a counterattack. Their actions did not allow the enemy to seize new positions. At the same time, however, the Russians stubbornly defended the positions they had captured before. While I was putting bullets one after another into the Russians crossing the river, my sergeant was looking through binoculars at the Russian-held positions. I suddenly noticed a soldier in a white fur hat who was clearly the commander, for he could always be seen in the thick of the fighting inspiring his men to fierce resistance. The sergeant touched my shoulder and told me that if I finished him off, our comrades would deal with the others more quickly. By this time I was well aware of the effect on the men of the presence of officers fighting side by side with them on the front line, and how the morale of the soldiers drops with the death of such commanders. I took 2 steps to the side and got into a good position, from which I had an excellent view of the trench occupied by the Russians. To be sure of finishing off the enemy, I loaded my rifle with one of the few rounds of bursting bullet ammunition I had left, which were not often found among the captured Russian ammunition. Holding the rifle in firing position, I waited for an opportunity to fire a deadly shot. The sergeant now served as my spotter. He could view the entire occupied trench through his binoculars, while I had a very limited view through my telescopic sight. Suddenly the fur hat reappeared over the edge of the trench. The rifle barrel turned in the right direction, but the target was out of sight again. However, the gunner had already done his part by determining the direction of the Russians' movement. Now I had caught the rhythm of the enemy's movement. I had to wait until he was in the crosshairs of my sight before I could shoot him at the same moment. I turned my rifle, taking a new small section of the trench in my sights. I waited for the decisive moment. I suddenly saw a fur hat in the telescopic sight. At the same second the shot of my rifle rang out, and the bullet entered the target. We saw the fur hat suddenly inflate sharply like a balloon, and in a moment burst with bloody splashes like an overripe melon. Having lost their commander, the Russians became confused and ceased to act with their former coherence. Taking advantage of this, the riflemen began to storm the Russian-occupied trench and in a bloody melee managed to massacre all the Soviet fighters there. Having shot the Russian commander, I immediately switched back to the Russians across the river. The sniper's strength now lay in his rapid and very accurate fire. The fighters floating on the rafts were proving to be a very easy target. Realizing this, they jumped into the water long before they reached the shore. For the sniper who was shooting at the heads sticking out of the water, what was happening was a kind of practice in aiming at a smoothly moving target. But the Russians continued their attack without regard for casualties, and the water in the river gradually took on a bloody hue. After a while it began to resemble the drainpipe of a slaughterhouse. Corpses, torn limbs and pieces of human bodies floated on the bloody water. My regiment was able to successfully repel all the attacks that fell upon it and hold its positions. But in neighboring areas, the Russians broke through the German defense line. The next night the regiment began its retreat. However, one of the basic laws of war states that a retreating enemy should not be given time to rest. The Russians had learned this firmly during the previous years of the war. And contrary to the hopes of the German soldiers who were giving their best, the pressure of the Russians on the retreating troops did not abate.